This is a little video to talk to you about sociological theory. I want to introduce the main theories that we'll be covering in this class, as well as provide a brief application so that there's a little bit more explanation about each of the theories, and that might also expose how they are similar and different. One of the first main theories that we're going to cover in this class is known as the structural functionalist theory. Now, it's also commonly referred to as functionalism, so you may also see that as well. In fact, the term structural functionalist theory is a combination of some different schools of thought that were really quite similar. The functionalist theory, in general, says that parts of society are working together, and they're working together for the overall good of society. In a functionalist perspective, oftentimes there's a thought of looking at the different parts of society as the same as organs in a body. If you think about our bodies, our heart can't really function without our blood. And our blood can't really function without other parts of our body, like our liver. All the pieces contribute to the whole. And that's an important part of functionalist theory. Oftentimes, functionalist theory will say that things are the way they are because they're contributing to the overall good. They're contributing to the whole, and they're making things work. So before we get to an example, I'd like to explain some of the other theories and go over some definitions. The next theory that we're going to talk about is social conflict theory. Social conflict theory, oftentimes just called conflict theory, doesn't have such a rosy picture about the parts of society. In fact, social conflict theory suggests that different parts of society have competing interests, and that those competing interests oftentimes are over power or other scarce resources like money. And an important conclusion that conflict theorists draw is that competition leads to winners and losers. So some groups win out and maybe get more power, more money, more resources, but that's really at the expense of other parties in society or other groups or other things in society. So, and oftentimes it's an unequal distribution. So it's not as though the groups that win out are an equal amount of the groups that don't. Rather, a small number of people win out and a much larger group of people suffer, so to speak, because they don't have an equitable distribution of resources. The two theories that I just covered are both broad-scale theories. They are looking at societies, big pieces. They're looking at groups, they're looking at institutions, and they're looking about how those things work together. I'm going to contrast and use a third sociological theory that's called symbolic interactionism. And this theory is different. It is not looking at those big picture items. Symbolic interactionism rather focuses in on the day-to-day interactions that people have. So in symbolic interactionism, the core ideas are that we have shared meanings with the people that we know. So in having shared meanings, we have common understandings about the world. And in those common understandings, we interact. And those kinds of interactions are our focus. How do people mediate regular communication? How do people negotiate when, say, they come from different perspectives? Symbolic interactionist theory is really looking at those day-to-day interactions to kind of see what happens, and that becomes the focus of measurement. Stepping away from that small-scale analysis, which is often called a micro-analysis, we're going to step back and go back into some of the big theories, also called macro-analysis, macro theories. And I'd like to introduce you to a theory called feminist theory. Now, it's also been called gender conflict theory or that sort of thing, because oftentimes the feminist theory is drawing on that bigger picture about conflict theory, in that there's competition between groups and some win out at the expense of others, and it specifically focuses on that inequality between men and women in a society. And it's looking at that inequality across different situations. What is the long-term inequality? What are the inequalities that we face right now? What are the inequalities in interaction? So if you think about feminist theory, it's essentially a social conflict approach, but applied directly to the inequalities of gender. The last theory that I'm going to introduce you to is perhaps one of the most challenging to explain of all, and that one is called postmodern theory. And the postmodern theory arose in kind of the late 1950s, early 1960s as a reaction to the strong scientific movements of the modernist theory. And the postmodern perspective rejects these ideas about that there's an objective truth out there. A lot of what postmodern theorists say is that the truth is quite relative, and we might not even be able to learn or know the truth. That's a pretty deep philosophical idea. And postmodern theory is a collection of a lot of different ideas, so it's not even one way to explain a postmodern perspective. There are other postmodern theorists that focus a lot on simulations of reality. So that kind of also goes along with this question about what do we know about truth, and is there an objective reality or not? And others have focused on things that have to do with consumerism and mass communications and rise of technology, and questions that are around that, and how that, it's not just that they're focused solely on those things, it's questions about how consumerism affects our reality and makes us question whether or not there is that objective reality. Some postmodern theorists have wanted to look closely at the art produced by a society to see what that says about the ideas and thoughts that are going on amongst the people within that society at that time. So postmodern theory is probably still evolving. Not that the other theories are not, but I think there's still a lot to contribute to a postmodernist perspective. I'm gonna provide some links if you would like to look into postmodern theory a little bit more detailed, with a little bit more detail, because I think you'll find it quite interesting if anything I've said about postmodern theory appeals to you. Now, I'm going to take a moment and do a quick application of each of the theories to one single phenomenon or one single thing to talk about. And hopefully it'll shed some light on what I've already said. While we're not studying the family now, and the family is going to be a really big part of discussions later in the semester, I'm going to use the family just as an example, since it works well with all the different theories. So first off, we're going to start with a functionalist perspective on the family. Functionalists generally would say that the family is this really uniting force, and it's an essential part of any society. It's a major institution within society, and it serves to bind people together. So the family is one of those first places where we have that bonding experience, where we have that unity with others. And the family socializes young children so that they understand how to better interact in society. So you can see that the family is a very functional unit within society. Now next, I'd like to use the social conflict perspective to analyze a family or families. Social conflict theorists might want to take a look at the family, not specifically about the conflict that might exist within a family, like arguments between family members, but perhaps look at positions of power in individual families and whether that leads to overall inequality. But social conflict theorists too might want to look at families in an aggregate. How do families of different with different skin colors fare in a particular society? Is there inequality between families? Does long-term inequality persist over time? These would be important questions that a social conflict theorist would ask. Now, taking that turn to consider what a symbolic interactionist would say, because remember, that's a micro-level analysis. We're going to look at really small-scale stuff. A symbolic interactionist, in thinking about the family, is going to want to look at those day-to-day interactions between family members. What are the relationships that happen within families? What are the nonverbal cues between families that teach us about the roles that each person is playing? How are the roles divvied up? Are the roles divvied up in a certain way, or in a regular way? What are the patterns of behavior that occur in families? A symbolic interactionist, if they were going to study the family, would probably plop down on your couch and sit around and take notes for a few weeks and just observe what they see, the patterns of behavior are in an individual family. Next, I want to apply the feminist theory to an analysis of the family. From a feminist perspective, the family consists of power, of people with unequal power. Oftentimes that's split between males and females. So it could be the heads of the family. If we're looking at a family that's headed by a male and a female, we might see disparities of power and influence in the family. It also applies to the children in a family. How do families raise boys and girls differently? Do families raise boys and girls to have different perspectives about power? Do they raise them so that males have more freedom and control and less chores than females? Those are some of the questions and analyses that come up in looking at using the feminist perspective, analyzing the family. And then finally, I want to talk about the postmodern perspective on the family. Certainly postmodernists might have some questions about the nature of families at all. What are our common definitions of families, and are they really true? Maybe there's a question about whether that's the reality of a family at all. So perhaps a more simple approach to considering the family using postmodern perspective is to take a look at things like consumer habits, early training on consumerism. How about the use of technology in a family? Does technology bring family members closer or farther apart? That also extends to communication, right? I've known all sorts of families that share mobile phones, that talk to each other constantly. And yet there's probably plenty of families that have the same amount of technology and communication in their hands that speak quite rarely. So these are all questions that I think a postmodern perspective would investigate when taking a look at the family.